Hey guys, welcome to Solo ReacTalk. This afternoon I'm going to be reacting to a video requested by Robert Fridays. It's called Mouse Utopia Experiment Down the Rabbit Hole, made on the YouTube channel Fredrik Knudsen. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the last name correct. Knudsen or Knudsen. Yes, hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. If you guys want to check out the original video as well as Fredrik Knudsen's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. Okay, let's start with Mouse Utopia Experiment Down the Rabbit Hole. 3, 2, 1, go.
Of the strange research to come out of mid-1900s America, there is little with a legacy as enduring or as terrifying as the Mouse Utopia experiments. Taking place throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s,
Wow, almost 3 decades. Okay.
the grim fate of the subjects was published in the national magazine Scientific American, and the experiments themselves were largely taken as apocalyptic portents.
Interesting that they would call it Mouse Utopia when the experiments were grim. That I'm assuming that like a lot of these rodents died in this experiment, and yet it's called the Mouse Utopia.
Post-war United States, the language used to describe the results such as behavior sync became synonymous with fears of an overpopulated world and violent, deviant behavior in cities. Today, they are preserved within fiction such as Channel 4's conspiracy thriller Utopia and the classic animated movie The Secret of NIMH.
Utopia, The Secret of NIMH. Okay, I'll check those out.
Our world began changing.
So what were the Mouse Utopia experiments? Shortly after World War II, a group known collectively as the environmentalists were making a large push to prevent environmental degradation, as well as overexploitation of the planet's renewable resources. Among these people were a group specifically known as the Neo-Malthusians, a term referring to the 18th and 19th century English scholar Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus proposed that, while the world's population may increase exponentially, food production can only increase linearly, leading to an eventual subsistence-level existence for the human race that became known as a Malthusian catastrophe.
No, not really. I think we've averted that sort of catastrophe in terms of the advent of, the industrialization of farming, where we have large tracts of lands that we irrigate for a monoculture type of farming, where we just farm a particular type of crop for hectares of land. We also have mechanized technology, we have synthetic technology in terms of synthetic fertilization. We have also, farms that focus purely on a specific breed of animal that we, breed for consumption, essentially. And I think we have avoided that sort of scenario for the most part across the globe. Yes, there are some countries that are still facing acute food shortages, and they don't really have the farming industrialized sector that is able to sustain their country, and therefore they depend on other countries to import, or should I say other countries to export their food to their countries so that they can survive. So yes, there are some countries that do face some food shortages, there are some countries that face famine, but in the majority, the world has put forward into industrialized farming, and it has succeeded. However, soil degradation, the environmental destruction due to over farming, over industrialized farming, and the ecological damage in terms of the biosphere wherever these industrialized farming sectors are based, it is creating havoc and destruction, and this is something that's going to be faced by future generations of the human population as they over farm large tracts of lands, and the soil there might be unviable for farming, and food might become scarce because some tracts of land have been over-farmed and the soil has been degraded to a point where it can no longer be used, and that might actually lead to famine in some countries, famine in some regions. But for now, we have avoided that type of scenario. Yeah. I better stop right here before I drift off. Okay.
While advancements such as the Green Revolution saw that this didn't come about, the Neo-Malthusians acknowledged his concerns about overpopulation and feared that this pattern would result in the collapse of civilization or, at best, have extreme adverse effects. These fears were given a platform in writing of the time, especially in works such as William Vogt's Road to Survival in 1948, and perhaps most famously, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962. Before the movement's explosion of popularity in the 50s and 60s, however, researchers had already begun work investigating the effects of population growth, and among them was a man named John B. Calhoun. Born in 1970.
John B. Calhoun. The only Calhoun I know is from Half-Life Blue Shift. Barney Calhoun. Yeah, that's the only Calhoun I know. So yeah, this is interesting that there is a John B. Calhoun. Okay, that's nice.
17, Calhoun took an early interest in science, specifically ornithology, publishing his first paper on birds when he was 15, but over time, his interest would change. By the time he received his PhD, his focus had turned to ethology, the study of animal behavior. When his education was concluded, he moved with his family to Towson, Maryland, to begin research at Johns Hopkins University in nearby Baltimore, but the research itself would be conducted much closer to home. In 1947, shortly after he arrived, he approached his neighbor about using some of their neglected property for an experiment. The scope would be massive, and according to Calhoun, his neighbor probably didn't expect such a scale when they agreed to let him use the forested area.
Wow, those are very nice neighbors you've got there, Calhoun. Yeah, I mean, I don't think if I should ask my neighbors if I could use a portion of their neglected property for my own experiments, whether they would agree to that. Yeah, you have very good neighbors, Calhoun, Mr. Calhoun.
Taking over a quarter of an acre, Calhoun constructed a massive habitat, complete with food, water, ample shelter, and protection from predators, with the only limiting condition being their restriction to the quarter-acre living space. He affectionately provided his enclosure a name, Rat City.
Rat City. Okay.
Unfortunately, no publicly available images of Rat City exist. Calhoun was very familiar with Norway rats, having performed research on them for his doctorate, and he estimated that Rat City could sustain approximately 5,000 individuals, though
5,000? Aren't we being a bit too ambitious there? 5,000? How many hectares of land did Mr. Calhoun's friend, or should I say neighbor, offer to him? I don't think I heard that part from Fredrik. If he did state that, then I'm sorry I didn't hear that from Fredrik. But 5,000, I think that's just a bit too ambitious. How do you feed 5,000 rats? How do you make sure that those 5,000 rats have got water? How do you make sure that those 5,000 rats have got the resources that they need to make their What do rats live in? Like nests? Yeah, like they're rat holes or something. I think it's just a bit too ambitious, but hey, let's see.
If they reached this number, the population density would be tight. He began by placing 5 pregnant females in the enclosure, providing ample genetic diversity, and soon the population was increasing exponentially.
I think you're gonna need more than 5 viable females. I think you'll need at least 100 viable females. At least 100, maybe even 2.
But then something surprising happened. Rather than the population increasing to fill the space of the enclosure, it quickly leveled off at 150 members.
That's not surprising. Like I stated before, maybe the space that has been allocated for these rats is not enough. It needs to be far larger. If you want to accommodate 5,000, it will need to be far larger. And when you also consider that a population explosion requires triggers, it needs to be a perfect type of scenario or environment for these rats to multiply to such numbers in such a short space amount of time. The viability of food needs to be there. The space for them to propagate and to further expand themselves needs to be there. The threat of animals that would want to eat them can also necessitate this process in these rats to further create more children for them to survive. So the fact that Rat City looks like a managed concentration camp is not going to work for the creation of 5,000 rats. I don't think so. I think there's many other factors that are needed for the population to exceed over 1,000 and go beyond that, go to 5,000.
He also noted some behavioral peculiarities. Despite the large size of Rat City, the residents seemed to gather around just a few places, forming social groups of 12 and limiting themselves to specific feeding locations. He would conclude the experiment after 2 years and 4 months, during which the population never grew over 200. Careful observation revealed the cause: high infant mortality. For some reason, as the experiment progressed and the population increased, the mothers were not caring for their young properly, leading to most of them dying before reaching maturity. Calhoun had his theories as to why this was, but to prove them, he would need more data. In 1954, about 5 years after his initial experiment concluded, he was hired by the National Institute of Mental Health.
Okay. National Institute of Mental Health. They're going to allow him to experiment with rats in the National Institute of Mental Health. Oh, okay.
Often shortened to NIM. Within the laboratory of psychology, Calhoun was given ample resources to continue his work. With a team, he began feverishly designing and constructing habitats, sometimes referred to as universes, where he performed numerous smaller-scale and more controlled versions of his original rat study on a domesticated strain of albino Norway rat.
Yeah, but you're going to go down the same path. If Mr. Calhoun wants to, have a population explosion, and he wants to achieve the targets of 5,000 rats, I don't think that these smaller, enclosed, experiment facilities is going to work. Yeah, if he wants 5,000, he's going to have to think about it in a far larger sense. Kilometers upon kilometers of land would need to be allocated. That's if he wants to focus on creating a population explosion, I think.
These rats would want for nothing. All physical needs for a healthy rat lifestyle would be provided for them, including food, water, climate control, and nesting material. Calhoun spent 8 years perfecting his enclosures and methods.
Why do they have red eyes? Oh.
Until finally, in February of 1962, an article of his writing was published in the magazine Scientific American.
Population density and social pathology. Let's zoom in. When a population of laboratory rats is allowed to increase in a confined space, the rats develop acutely abnormal patterns of behavior that can even lead to the extinction of the population. Alright.
The article was entitled Population Density and Social Pathology. His opening paragraph ominously reads so, quote, "In the celebrated thesis of Thomas Malthus, vice and misery impose the ultimate nature of population. Students of the subject have given most of their attention to misery.
Sorry guys, something happened with the video there. Let me just go back a bit.
Have given most of their attention to misery, that is, to predation, disease, and food supply as forces that operate to adjust the size of a population to its environment. But what of vice? Setting aside the moral burden of this word, what are the effects of the social behavior of a species on population growth, and of population density on social behavior?" Unquote. To answer this question, he cited 6 of his experiments in particular, all with similar composition and concerningly similar results. The design of these habitats was simple. The layout was a rectangle measuring 10 feet by 14 feet, divided into 4 equal sections by electric fences. 3 of these fences sported bridges over which the rats could climb, while one fence lacked such a bridge, essentially creating one long space that wrapped in on itself. Each section was equipped similarly, with a food hopper, water, and nesting areas accessible by spiral staircases. But Calhoun, leveraging his experience with the rats, made special changes to encourage specific behaviors. He enticed the rats to use one of the center pens by making the spiral staircase to that pen's living spaces shorter than the others, though he admits this was a comparatively small factor. But
won't that cause a bit of conflict with the rats? As they would probably all prefer that space to live in.
The more insidious change was to their food supply. In half of the experiments, Calhoun supplied powdered food, but in the other half he placed feeders of his own design, consisting of hard pellets behind a wire mesh. Half of his experiments began with 32 mice, the other half with 56, of evenly male and female composition, and all having just reached maturity. Calhoun estimated that approximately 40 rats could comfortably be housed in these enclosures, but he would allow these populations to increase to 80 before he would cull them. Almost immediately after introduction, things began to go awry. The females, unsurprisingly, spread themselves out somewhat evenly through the pens, but after the males jockeyed for dominance and those of highest rank were determined, they began to distribute themselves strangely.
Oh, so the mice can also determine who has the strongest hierarchy amongst them, while in terms of the males, they jostle with each other, they fight with each other until the victor is proclaimed, and that one becomes the dominant male that produces more offspring with the females. Okay, interesting.
Less dominant male rats will typically awaken earlier and begin to wander and forage for food, and due to the design of the pen, this meant that they usually would end up in the center sections to eat. During this time, the dominant males of the outer pens would wake up and begin guarding their respective territories. Since there was only one entrance ramp to either end, the dominant males of either pen would bar the return of the less dominant males, forcing the male population to clump in the center pens, while the dominant end males protected what came to be their harems. Only a few other deferential males were allowed to remain. These few remaining males began exhibiting odd behavior. Though they would spend most of their time in the burrows with the females, hiding away from the dominant male, they would never attempt to mate with any of them. Instead, perplexingly, they would try to mate with the dominant male, and even more perplexing, the dominant male would not fight these attempts.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Okay.
At the same time as this was happening, the effect of Calhoun's special feeders was taking hold. Since procuring food was such a lengthy process at the hard food feeders, it was common for one rat to join another while in the process of feeding. By this method, the rats slowly became conditioned to eating in the company of other rats until, eventually, the rats would refuse to eat unless another rat was present. Since more rats tended to be in the center pens, this behavior meant that, over time, more and more rats made their way there, further condensing them. This heightened the proximity of an already cramped population. In the experiments with the powdered food, this effect was far less pronounced. With these factors combined, Calhoun noted what he called a behavioral sink, or an increase in pathological activity in the rats due to the stress involved in such high population density. For the females, the behavioral sink
Behavioral sink. Okay.
manifested in reduced capacity for nest building and young rearing. Infant rats are extremely dependent upon their mothers for nearly all things. However, under the effects of the behavioral sink, the mothers would often be interrupted in their nest building practices to engage in some other social activity.
Well, I can imagine, because the population within this small contained space is just becoming unbearable, and there are a lot of these male rodents that are going to be in heat, if I can say that, for lack of a better word, and they're going to always want to mate with the females, and it's just going to create this complicated and toxic situation where the females can't be mothers. They always have to be running away or fighting against other males who want to have a sexual interaction with them. So it's going to be a constant battle, just trying to keep themselves away from the males and try to focus on becoming a mother to the children. They will find it extremely difficult, and because they're in such a small, tight, contained space, there is nowhere to run to. There's nowhere to run to.
As time wore on, this led to sparser nests which could not house the young properly. If a mother decided to move her litter, she often would only move some of them or scatter them about the pen in separate locations. What's more, when female rats are ready to mate, the males can sense it, and the enclosed space meant that a female could not escape the continuous advances of the males during these periods.
Exactly.
Even when they would enter their nests for a reprieve, they would be followed in and harrowed. These factors together resulted in an extremely high infant mortality rate, in one case reaching 96%. For the males, this manifested in different ways. The dominant males would occasionally lash out in violence against the other members of the pen, including infants, often biting and wounding their tails. Among the lower class males were three groups. The first he described as the homosexuals, which he immediately corrects as pansexuals, who would not compete for status but would often attempt to mate with any other rat, regardless of gender or age. Much like in the end pens, these advances went unchallenged. The second group he described as somnambulists, who moved slowly through the pen without interacting with other individuals in any fashion, and the other rats, in turn, ignored them, except in rare circumstances. These rats, externally, he described as fat, sleek, and healthy looking. But to him, the strangest group was the third, which he named the probers.
Hold on, let me write all of this down. Group 1. Pansexuals. 2. 3 probers. Okay.
These rats were hyperactive, hypersexual, and pansexual. Despite violence from the dominant males, they would viciously pursue females in heat, eschewing any sort of courtship ritual and following them into their burrows to mate. Later on in the experiments, they would often find the corpses of the improperly cared for young, which they would cannibalize. In time,
My gosh.
one of Calhoun's assistants would publicly describe these pens as hell. At this point, Calhoun ended the experiments, but he predicted that these pathological changes would have eventually led to the deaths of the colonies. At their conclusion, he would take the 4 healthiest males and females and allow them to breed, but their behavior had been so inexorably altered that none of their pups survived beyond weaning.
I mean, when you consider their upbringing, yes, they can be healthy physically, but mentally, they are not. They're not fit to be parents. They're not fit to be, those that would carry on the generation of the rats or the mice. Yeah. They're just not in the right state of mind to be parents.
This short article enraptured its US audience, and the effects on both the scientific world and popular culture were immediate. People began to relate Calhoun's rat experiments to modern city life, and in an era where fear of social deviance was reaching an extreme high, it was largely seen as a reflection of the current time and where society could be heading.
No, I think we're exaggerating there. I think we are connecting dots that are not meant to be connected. Humans are far more evolved creatures. We are far more evolved. We have developed a society that would negate this type of situation where we are finding with these rat populations that have been confined in this small space. The fact that we can travel out from our large cities, we can populate other rural, semi-rural areas and create new families outside of the major cities. The fact that we have the technology, we have the understanding to avoid any potential societal breakdown that would result in families becoming these horrific scenes of just creating children willy-nilly. Like we're not at that point, and I don't think we'll ever get to that point where the structure of a family would be utterly destroyed and we would just focus on our vices, essentially. There is order, there is laws, there are cultural and religious and societal building blocks that maintain humanity in our various civilizations and our cities that we have built and the countries that we live in. There are many checks and balances that make sure that we can't head down the path of these rats. So I think for us to connect the dots between this experiment and the population explosion in our cities or in our countries, it's not going to work. It doesn't work, there's already evidence of countries like, for instance, China or smaller countries that have got extremely high population. They haven't gone to this route. They haven't delved into this type of societal degradation that we're seeing here with the rats. So, yeah. And also another country like India as well. Very large population. I think it's 1.2 billion people. And yet their society is still functioning. It's still functioning. Their culture, their way of life is still family orientated, family rooted, and organized in that fashion. So for us to try and relate to what's happening here with these rats to human development and our societal and cultural cultural progression, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Yeah.
Egged on by Calhoun's provocative language and allegorical design of his test environment, made to look like a city, population density quickly became a common topic. Psychologist Carl Rogers, in his work Some Social Issues Which Concern Me, stated that, quote, "The resemblance to human behavior is frightening. In humans, we see poor family relationships, the lack of caring, the complete alienation, the magnetic attraction of overcrowding, the lack of involvement which is so great that it permits people to watch a long, drawn-out murder without so much as calling the police. Perhaps all..."
That sort of notion happens in certain cities. It doesn't happen all over the world, you know. And also with families being left broken, it is not in the majority. It is in the minority. It is definitely in the minority. Especially when you consider city life. It's not all the same. Just because the cities where you are performing your experiments or you are researching on, have these societal problems, doesn't mean that all cities across the world are going to be facing the same situation or the same paths, because we are not homogeneous. We're not homogeneous, in our thought process. We're not homogeneous in the way we view life. We are not homogeneous in the way we practice our existence. So it's also very limited, in terms of this doctor in his assertions. It's very limited.
All city dwellers are inhabitants of a behavioral sink, unquote. Soon after, studies of dense urban environments were conducted to see if these effects translated directly to humans, but what they found was inconclusive and unsatisfying. Despite the suggestions of Calhoun's rats, humans in cities reacted differently or sometimes opposite the manner that researchers expected, depending on the location. No matter how they tried, no evidence of a widespread behavioral sink could be found in urban areas. But this did not dissuade Calhoun. Even as others explored the problem of overcrowding, Calhoun frantically continued his research. Now a celebrated success and emboldened by the public acceptance of his ideas,
man, even the Pope? Wow.
He resumed his work at NIM on an even larger scale, though again away from the public eye. He spent his time on new subjects as he continued to perfect his enclosures and experiments until finally, after 11 years, Calhoun revealed his magnum opus through an article he entitled Death Squared, which was published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine in January of 1973. The lengthy opening to this article was undeniably apocalyptic. Calhoun wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are the two deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution, in terms of ancient wisdom, is the acquisition of access to the tree of life."
Sounds very religious, but okay.
Unquote. He goes on to heavily reference revelations and of the riders of the apocalypse, using them to proclaim that the Hippocratic Oath applies not only to the body, but to the spirit. After this dramatic introduction, he described his test. For the most part, these new experiments were similar to his 1963 trials, including unlimited access to food and water, protection from the elements and predators, and safeguards against disease. Many parts, however, were drastically altered. As Calhoun mentions in his introduction, the Norway rats used in his first publicized experiments were replaced with albino house mice, which were taken from a breeding group from the National Institutes of Health made specifically to prevent communicable disease. To fit his new subjects, Calhoun had designed an entirely new enclosure. This version was much more vertical, with 16 wall-mounted housing areas for the rats at the tops of long metal tubes, which Calhoun called walk-up apartments. At the bottom of each apartment was a virtually unlimited supply of food, water, and nesting material. With the space provided, Calhoun estimated that it could potentially hold 3,840 mice.
He's still thinking high numbers here. He's still thinking very, very ambitious high numbers. I'm afraid it's just not going to be achieved. No. The same problems that were dealt with the previous experiments are going to be faced here again with this new one, because like I've stated before, the size of these experiment cubicles or space is just too small. It's just too small to the point where the population would collapse on itself, and the infant mortality rate of the mice is going to be just a mirror image of what has happened in previous experiments. If you want the population to exceed 3,840, you're going to need a vast tract of land so that the mice can roam around, they can be free, they can be attacked and eaten by birds or whatever other predator animal that would want to eat the mice. You need that sort of natural natural activity for the population to grow naturally. Because if you have the same sort of mice with the same sort of attitude, with the same sort of activity that they would do day in, day out, it just creates this stagnant situation that will not be able to proceed forward. There has to be death, but it has to be natural. There has to be space for them to grow. There have to be places where the female mice can head off to take care of their children, where they will not be interfered by the male rats that always want to mate, or when they sense that the female is ready to mate. So this number, it's just too much. I think you need to decrease your expectation.
He named this enclosure Universe 25. Calhoun's methods also had changed. Rather than instituting population controls, he would interfere far less. His plan was to place 8 mice in the enclosure, 4 male and 4 female, and simply watch and wait. Calhoun observed 4 distinct phases in the ensuing experiment. Phase A was predictable, constituting the time period before the first new mice were born, which ended up being 104 days. For the mice, these days were, quote, marked by considerable social turmoil. After the social order was established and the first brood was born, the population began Phase B, which Calhoun named the exploitation phase. During this time, the mice doubled in number every 55 days as new young grew to maturity and had their own young. This doubling continued until day 315, after which the doubling rate slowed to a rate of 145 days, nearly 3 times as long. By this point, the different broods had clumped into one side of the pen, exhibiting the same sort of clumping as the Norway rats, but this time without any coaxing from Calhoun's designs. This change in the rate of procreation marked Phase C, which Calhoun labeled as the stagnation phase. This is when the most notable events occurred, and they eerily mirrored Calhoun's rat experiments. In a natural setting, those mice which find no social niche will leave the colony, but in this experiment, emigration was impossible, and so those forced to remain withdrew from society. These dejected males formed a large pool in the center of the enclosure. They quickly became characterized by both their inactivity and their many scars and wounds. Occasionally, they would grow agitated and attack one another, and with nowhere to retreat, the recipient of these attacks would simply lay still and endure the assault. The outcast females, rather than joining them, would retreat to the highest apartments and live quietly among one another. It was during this time that the behavioral sink manifested, with mice gathering around specific food hoppers in large numbers, while others remained almost entirely untouched, showing how, again, the need for social interaction had become so intertwined with the need for food that the former had overtaken the latter. The males who had won the initial fights also were placed under extreme stress. As more and more mice reached maturity from within and without, the leaders of the social groups continually had to patrol and defend their territory. Eventually, they reached the point of exhaustion and could not defend the females within their group. These females were...
And when you consider how many mice are in this enclosed environment, there is no winning for too long. Eventually, you're going to be overrun.
Were therefore forced to defend the nest themselves, even when nursing their young, leading to generalized aggressive behavior. This aggression would inevitably be misdirected onto their young, who would be wounded by their mothers and forced to leave the nest before they were finished weaning. Much like the rats, the mother mice would also forget some of their young when moving from one nesting site to another. Due to the added stress of defending their territory, sometimes the mothers would reabsorb unborn mice in the womb, further reducing the fertility rates. Calhoun writes, "For all practical purposes, there had been a death of societal organization by the end of Phase C. Finally, there was Phase D, which Calhoun entitled the Death Phase. This phase was characterized largely by an entire generation of young who had been rejected by their mothers early and forced to leave the nest, and they were...
And they don't know anything about being a caregiver or being a female mice or a male mice. You know, they don't know anything. They don't have that societal structure in their minds, and thus they're just these wandering mice that they're just acting on instinct, and that's about it. That's as far as they get.
Therefore unable to exhibit normal social behavior. This manifested in numerous ways. The females of this generation had far fewer children, and those that did have children lacked the maternal instincts necessary to raise them beyond weaning. Calhoun goes on to describe the males of this generation. Quote, "Male counterparts to these non-reproducing females were soon dubbed the beautiful ones. They never engaged in sexual approaches toward females, and they never engaged in fighting, and so they had no wound or scar tissue. Thus, their pelage remained in excellent condition. Their behavioral repertoire became largely confined to eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming, none of which carried any social implications beyond that represented by contiguity of bodies." Unquote. As the last mice with reproductive instincts aged beyond their fertility, Calhoun declared that the last male would die around day 1780 of the experiment, effectively rendering the colony dead as it would be unable to produce any more young. His present tense language implied that, when the article was published, the colony was still technically alive, though its final fate was practically sealed. Calhoun closed his article with a call to action. "For an animal so complex as man, there is no logical reason why a comparable sequence of events should not also lead to species extinction. If opportunities for role fulfillment fall far short of the demand by those capable of filling roles and having expectancies to do so, only violence and disruption of social organization can follow. Individuals born under these circumstances will be so out of touch with reality as to be incapable even of alienation.
Yes, I hear what Mr. Calhoun is trying to say here. However, like I've stated before, the planet, or should I say humanity, is not, we are not homogeneous in our way of thought and the way we live on planet Earth. We're not homogeneous. Humanity is not going to head down this path because of our diversity, because of the way we think, because of the way we do things. We are unpredictable, more unpredictable than these mice, more unpredictable than the rats and all these other rodents that were experimented on. We are far more unpredictable. So I don't think humanity is ever going to go down this path. There's just too many of us having too many ideals and dreams and thought processes and, our cultures, our religions, our upbringings, where we come from. There's just too many of us. There's just too much of a diversity mix for anything like this to occur. Yeah, I that's what I think.
Most complex behaviors will become fragmented. Acquisition, creation, and utilization of ideas appropriate for life in a post-industrial, cultural, conceptual, technological society will have been blocked. Just as biological generativity in the mouse involves this species' most complex behaviors, so does ideational generativity for man. Loss of these respective complex behaviors means death of the species. But even as Calhoun was performing his research on mice, others had been at work applying his theories to humans. By this point, researchers had moved to more specific locations of overcrowding rather than the generalized location of cities, testing the effects on students in dormitories and patients at hospitals, but the most fruitful example they discovered was in prisons. Paul Paulus from the University of Texas wrote that prisons were the perfect place for this sort of study, describing the social interaction between inmates as intense, prolonged, inescapable, and realistic. The prison in the study also offered the closest analog to Calhoun's rat experiments, since the prisoners could not escape the company of others, even in their communal cells. There, they found connections between over-socialization and suicide, violence, psychopathy, and stress. After such studies, environmental psychologists identified two different kinds of density: physical density and social density. Physical density was the amount of space per person, while social density was the number of individuals occupying a space. They found that social density was the much more important factor, as individuals in high social density were unable to control their interactions with others. Based on this research, human environments could be designed to at least partially mitigate these issues, allowing those living within them the privacy they needed to maintain healthy social interaction. Outside of scientific discourse, Calhoun's rhetoric has maintained its strength through the years, with different groups of all political persuasions bending his results to support their views on social degradation, however they may define it. Among more scholarly...
I don't think they should use it. I really don't think they should use it. It's an interesting experiment focusing on the mice, but when it comes to human beings, it's a totally different matter altogether. I can understand in terms of the prison system in America and how it functions, and in terms of the physical density or the social density, yes, there might be some sort of correlation or some sort of connection there with the experiments that Mr. Calhoun was commencing. But still, I'm saying that humanity is very diverse. We have different ways of dealing with different situations. And if politicians want to use these experiments and the findings of these experiments in their assertions of, in their debates, I should say, to justify their point of view, I think that is a very dangerous line to take.
Sources, Calhoun has been both lauded and criticized for his work. Those who support him cite his forward thinking about overpopulation, while those who deride him cite his misrepresentation of the actual social problems within cities, guiding discourse away from the true causes of societal discord. But no matter what those in the modern day think of his research, his influence on the way America views its cities is undeniable.
Alright guys, that is it with Mouse Utopia Experiment Down the Rabbit Hole, made on the Fredrik Knudsen YouTube channel. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. If I'm not, I am so sorry, Fredrik. Really I am. And this was a request by Robert Fridays. Mr. John B. Calhoun's experiments were interesting, in terms of what he wanted to accomplish. He was ambitious in terms of the types of rat or mice populations he tried to achieve. And like I've stated before, it was just not going to happen. It was just not going to happen. In an enclosed environment, the way these mice and rats were contained, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to work. It needs to be a far larger expanse of land. And yes, the rats must die in some sort of way. Either they have to be eaten by other animals, or they have to die due to other natural causes. You need that sort of, natural activity for there to be a proper progression to a population explosion. Because just making things perfect, making sure that they have the food, making sure they have water, making sure that they have housing, is just not enough. There needs to be that sort of disorder. And that is the natural way of things. And through that natural way of things, if the population continues to grow naturally, the females are able to expand themselves further away from males, and the males who are protecting their herons, at least they will have the space, they will have the attitude and the ability to be that responsible male protecting its young against intruders. So the type of environment that Mr. John B. Calhoun was trying to create for these experiments, it was just too small, and he was never going to achieve the population density he was targeting. In terms of the first one, 5,000, the second one was 3,000. 3,000 what? I forgot how many, but yeah, around 3,000 mice. It was just not going to be possible. And in terms of Mr. John B. Calhoun's assertions that him trying to connect what has happened in his experiments to what could possibly happen with humans and human cities, and the overpopulation of human cities, and the behavioral sink of society, I'm also not really 100% agreeing with that type of assertion, because like I've stated before, the diversity of humanity in all of its shapes and forms and beauty and disgustingness, it all prevents these types of situations from happening. And like I've also stated before, our cities are not contained. People can leave the cities. People can go to smaller cities or to rural towns or to semi-rural towns, and they can, create their own families out there. They can become productive citizens of the nation. We are not all contained in these major cities. And even in these major cities, there is a societal structure, there are laws, there are cultural and religious, thoughts and beliefs that are entrenched in young people at a very young age. And as they grow up to become adults, those lessons, those things that they've learned at a young age, it's imprinted on them, and they become a citizen of that city in some sort of way. Not all of us are going to descend into a societal breakdown of, just violence, violence against civilians, or violence against themselves, or, just destroying the city purely for their own selfish needs. No. And like I've also stated before, these experiments and other related experiments are focusing on American culture, on American cities. And like I've stated before, the diversity of humanity is just too complex for us to make a one-shoe-fits-all attempt with these experiments. And that's why I'm saying that humanity is not going to fall down this path. There's many other nations with far more larger populations that have been able to maintain themselves, that have been able to grow and create a society with their extremely large populations. Yes, they have problems, but it's not to the point where they are heading down the path of extinction as a society. So yes, what John B. Calhoun was trying to do here with these experiments was interesting, but I don't think we should really connect humanity to how these experiments were conducted, especially with these mice. It's just not the same. It's not the same. Yeah. Alright, guys, that is it. Thank you again to Robert Fridays for the request. This was a very interesting video. Very thought-provoking. And also thank you to Fredrik Knudsen for creating this video based on the Mouse Utopia Experiments. Very, very interesting video. And yeah, hopefully you guys also enjoyed my reaction to it. If I've made some mistakes, or if you don't understand what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry about that. I'm really sorry about that. But yeah, in the comment section, if you want to further explain something that I might have gotten wrong, or you want to correct me on a certain statement that I've said, then please do. In the comment section, you can do that. And yeah, thanks Robert Fridays. Thank you for your continued support. And guys, remember, if you want to check out the original video as well as Fredrik Knudsen's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. If you like my reaction, please give it a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Okay? Bye-bye.